I think we've talked about this previously, that the national sports ban, like they are going to make moves to try to make trans women's participation in sports illegal throughout the country, basically. Obviously, we've seen these laws passing in individual states. We've been talking about this for over a year now. Clearly, like, just get this couple of things out of the way. We've looked into it, and the research shows that the main disparity between male and female athletes is how much funding those sports get. So if you were to provide the same facilities and coaches and stuff for women as you do men, then women are actually fully capable of competing against men. Generally speaking, there is a slight strength advantage for males and a slight stamina advantage for females. So in races like marathons, like endurance sports, women tend to actually do much better than men. Like women's leagues were mostly created as a way to ensure that men did not feel challenged. Like they wanted to preserve men's ability to win. Why is it that there is a different league for figure skating or for shooting? Like why are shooting gun as a sport? Why is that one segregated? Well, it's because initially there weren't any rules against women joining, but women didn't join generally. And then when women started to join, they would win. And then they would be like, oh no, women aren't allowed. And then they would set up a separate women's league. Like that's why you have women's sports, y'all. It's literally male supremacy. You've been brainwashed into accepting the idea that you're inherently biologically inferior. When you account for weight and height, like honestly, humans are barely sexually dimorphic. It's not that big of a deal. But these people really are invested in the idea that there are fundamental differences, that you can't fundamentally change your sex, that like these characteristics are immutable, or that you're playing with God by trying to change them, or like you're destroying something natural and beautiful by changing your body, whatever. And so, you know, this conversation has worked its way up to the national level where like basically Title IX, I think they're choosing to interpret Title IX as being like somewhat flexible. Like it doesn't apply to the sports thing, or like their way of protecting sex-based rights under Title IX is this idea that you shouldn't go on the opposite sex sports team, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Most of the sports differences come from differences in training styles and funding. Yeah, that's what I'm saying, Avi. Like we've read into it on this show about how the main differences in performance between male and female athletes is entirely, you can predict it entirely based on like how well funded their sports programs are. So before we go too much further, I just want to say, hit the like button if you're enjoying the content. Consider subscribing and hitting the bell and maybe clicking all notifications to get notifications for the channel. Also consider checking out my brand new merch store, which just launched. There's going to be a link down in the description. And you can also check out my Patreon, where there are some promo deals for patrons if you want to maybe get a deal on some of your merchandise. So thank you very much for watching the content. Hope you continue to enjoy. But anyway, so yesterday as of this stream, I suppose I should clarify that there's been a hearing at the House Government Oversight Committee. They've held a hearing referring to and referencing Biden's Title IX guidance, which basically proposed changes to the Title IX regulations regarding student eligibility for athletic teams. So this hearing is essentially trying to get public comment. All kinds of crazy nonsense was said during this. Apparently it was like at times a fairly raucous occasion. I think one of the weirdest things to have come out of this whole day is comments that were made by Representative Glenn Grothman. I do not know your name, my dude. I'm so sorry. But he stated that his reason for wanting there to be a trans sports ban is that, like, if people medically transition so that they can be on the sports team that they want to be on, then they will not be likely to switch back. Like, he's basically saying he wants to pass this national sports ban because that means that trans people would detransition. Like that they would be less likely to be persistent with their medical care or something. I'm really not sure what the logic is behind that. Obviously, of course, he claimed that 80 to 90 of people detransition. Obviously, that's untrue. The real number is between 1% to 3%. Most of those retransition later. And the reason that they detransition is because of lack of social acceptance. Statistically, we've looked into it. So what his statement in full was, I sometimes wonder if we normalize the idea of guys playing in women's sports, are you kind of wondering if we're creating a system, which would be tragic if it's true, that some of these guys will never switch back? He further commented, I think it would have been too bad if they would have been, one of the 80 or 90% who snap back, but because of this, they won't. This meaning, like, I assume, like, medically transitioning in order to be on the correct sports team. Like, again, like, I guess the assumption that medically transitioning means you won't ever detransition. Like, clearly, most trans people who start hormones stay on hormones because it makes an immensely positive change to their lives. Again, there are reasons why there are so few medical detransitioners who really stick with it long term. It's the same way that some atheists will say that they're religious again because of social outcasting if they're atheist, right? Or like never coming out in the first place because they know, right, that they're not going to have social acceptance. Like, imagine being the pastor and like realizing that your faith is crumbling. What are you going to do? Get in touch with the Recovering from Religion Foundation is what you should do, because they can help. But anyway, unexpected plugs. Did you know that I used to be hardcore in the atheist community? I know a lot of people who work at those organizations. Correct, yes. Nothing having to do with them having faith or not. Everything to do with access to support systems. Also, this is more evidence that their goal is to have as few trans people as possible. Yeah, they've said it in a number of different ways at this point. They continue to say it, like their goal is for people to desist. Their goal is for as many people as possible to not commit to their transition and be integrated in society. Like, they just want there to not be trans people. They know this. Hardcore religiosity is part of why I'm not ready to share my new self with the rest of my family. Yeah, why is it that religion is like the number one thing most queer people have to worry about in terms of like reasons that our family is not accepting us? How, like, it's so high on the list. I think in America, at least, it might be the number one cause for familial relationship failure after someone attempts to come out as trans or queer. All right, here we go.
From what I've read, the vast majority of people, 80 to 95%, who go what they call discordant gender identity, eventually come back to their original gender.
Not true.
And I sometimes wonder, as we normalize this idea of guys playing in women's sports, are you kind of creating a situation, which would be tragic if it's true, that some of these guys are now never going to switch back because their whole social setting is praising them for switching? And I think it would be just kind of too bad if they would have been the 80 or 90.
So you can't celebrate trans lives. You can't celebrate trans people because then they might not detransition. He literally just said you have to impose social consequences on people so that they will want to detransition. Like, he's revealed the tactics. Sorry, my hat is all crooked again. Like, just genuinely coming out and straight up saying these people won't want to switch back if they're being celebrated. So yeah, trans people can't win at anything. They can't be affirmed. You can't like validate them in any way because they might not detransition then. Just outright stating that that's the plot. That's the plan. If we're not mean to trans people, then it will be harder to torture them back into the closet. Exactly. It's so hard to torture them back into the closet. Also, why is every American politician 100 years old? Yes. Why are people who grew up in buildings with lead paint running the country? I think you have brainworms, sir. I think you have brainworms, just like the apples in my orchard. He revealed, he took the mask off while also framing it as being supportive. Disgusting.
95% had snapped back, but because of this, they won't. Do you think that's a concern, Ms. Perry?
I think absolutely it's a concern. In fact, studies show that 75 to 90%.
Press your microphone button, lady.
Your mic. Through 75 to 90% of children, if allowed to progress through normal puberty, eventually make peace with their natal biological sex and avoid the trans dilemma altogether. We also know, based on studies, that social transitioning, including playing on a team specifically articulated by the Biden administration in its notice of proposed rulemaking, playing on the team that you want specifically for your gender identity, not based on sex, is an entree into ultimate medical transitioning. Now, with the rise...
Yeah, they're basically just saying if we allow people to join the teams, then they're going to medically transition because that's what we require for them to be on the teams. And if they medically transition, then they probably won't detransition. Therefore, we can't let them play on the teams. Like, it's so weird where's he getting this 90% stat? I know the statistical jump between 75 to 90%. He's referring to the 80% statistic that actually gets used, but then he's just kind of wildly flubbing it around and saying, well, if it's 80%, then it might as well be 90%. 80% of all of the kids who were brought to a clinic to see if they might be trans based on some kind of question or inclination, 80% of those, when sent through the rigorous process of determining which ones are going to be persistent, they determined that 80% of those weren't going to be persistent. They just had a little bit of a gender question, and it's fine. Like, they're cis, they resolved. And then the 20% that are proven through that system of, like, checking in with them every few years, like, talking to the parents, having an ongoing relationship, those ones who are insistent and persistent, they are trans, and they then go on to be on puberty blockers, and almost 100% of people who go on puberty blockers go on to take cross-sex hormones because they have been proven through the gatekeeping system to need that care, and it is, like, also the fact that they are needing the care. Like, they were correctly diagnosed, basically, is how you would put that in, like, normal people language. Like, they were successfully diagnosed as trans, and they persisted, right? But they are always implying here that these kids start identifying as trans, and then they start socially transitioning, and some of them even start medical transition, and then they decide that this is not for them and that they're not really trans. Overwhelmingly, that's not what is happening. But yeah, so that's where that 80% comes from, is like 80% of all the kids who had questions at this one particular clinic during this one particular frame of time, 80% of those were determined to not be in need of further health care regarding gender identity, basically. But then, yeah, they use it dishonestly, and at this point, they're not even sticking to the number of 80%. Like, 80 to 90% of these, they snap back and they go back to where they were at the beginning, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, people being nice to trans kids is a gateway drug to them becoming trans adults. True. We can't have that. Absolutely can't have that. That's even dumber than just making up a number. I know, it's called misrepresenting the data. It's like, no matter what you do, there's always going to be a bias to the data. It's just how, like, honest your bias is, I guess. I have a bias toward trans kids being healthy and living longer lives and having better mental health outcomes, right? And I admit that I have that bias. I am going to look at data in a specific way because, ultimately what I want is for kids to not be harmed. So I'm going to try to look at the data as honestly as possible. But I want trans kids to be affirmed while also making sure that no one is being harmed, right? But if you have a belief system that no one should transition, and especially kids shouldn't transition, then you're going to twist every bit of data, maybe even not doing it on purpose. Because I don't necessarily want to assign malicious intent to every single idiot who repeats the 80% thing, but I just think that they aren't intellectually honest enough to really look into it, and that they reflexively perceive the data to support their position, and that they are not interested in questioning whether or not it actually supports their position. And if you press them on that, they will just shift the goalposts to something else. Like, if you press them on whether their data is actually, like, relevant to the conversation in any way, or that it says what they say it does, they're just gonna dodge you. There's no winning with these people. They will just keep gish galloping at you. They're just going to keep throwing shit at the wall until something trips you up. My mom believes that trans people will regret their transition later in life. I mean, you could ask her where all these detransitioners allegedly are. Ask her why they keep having to trot out the same 2 or 3 people all across the country, and they keep flying them around. Surely they would be able to find more individuals willing to speak out, compared to the huge number of trans minors and young adults and activists across the country who show up in support of trans people. They show up in opposition of these bills restricting our rights. Like, ask her why there are so many different trans people saying this is going to hurt me and here's how, versus the 3 people we hear the same names of over and over again. Maybe the grifter budget is running out. Oh, it's not running out. The reason that they only have 3 detransitioners is not because the grifter budget is running out. A billionaire is funding it, and we read a very in-depth article about how a specific organization that I cannot remember the name of right this second is funding this. It's a billionaire. It's because they literally only have 2 or 3 individuals who are detrans, and willing to be transphobic. Is there anything else worth listening to in this 20 seconds?
Of detransitioners, which we've seen in widespread
So
formats,
many.
including out in California,
Oh my
where
God.
Kaiser Permanente is subject to multiple lawsuits for fast-tracking gender identitarian surgeries. The mind reels at what the implications are going to be.
Gender identitarian surgeries. I've never heard that one before. That's a new one for me. Gender identitarian surgeries. Amazing. It's laughable, and they're going to try to take away our rights, and I don't think that they have the votes required, and even if they have the votes required, I don't know whether Biden's going to sign it or not, or like, I don't really know what the situation is going to be like by the time this thing gets pushed through. This entire hearing is a virtue signal. Right, because like, you know, again, that's the one thing that I appreciate the honesty of Nikki Haley, I think is her name, is that she will at least honestly say, it doesn't matter whether I think abortion should be legal or not. There's no way that we're going to pass a major restriction with the Congress the way that it is. So like, there's no point really in campaigning on that because you're realistically not going to be able to push anything through. So this is just like a huge waste of time essentially, and like a huge waste of taxpayer money because they know that this is not going to pass through. But anyway, Riley Gaines was there.
And the security to stand firm in my belief that men should not be playing in women's sports.
I know we had a witness suggested that because you worked so hard all your life to be the best, I mean, you were the best in female swimming. There's no question about that. And to have to lose or share a title with a biological male, you know, we had a witness on the panel suggest you should have just lost gracefully. I mean, I think that is a slap in the face to any athlete who works so hard. I mean, I was a...
Okay, I can't let him continue, but he's so quiet. Riley Gaines tied with Leah for 5th place in like the one race that they raced together. Tied. So Riley Gaines is not one of the best swimmers in the country. She's never won a title, so she didn't have a title to share. I just need to get that out there because like, oh my God, we're going to praise her. We're going to call her one of the best athletes in the country. Like, girl, she is mediocre. She tied for 5th place with a biological male. Like, I mean, it's pretty bad for both of them that they got 5th place. Okay, we're just going to be honest here. Good gracious.
Below mediocre basketball player on my high school basketball team, I can't imagine the work that you put in, that any great athlete, male or female, puts in. And I don't think you should lose gracefully. I think you should do exactly what you've been doing.
She's just a bad sport. Like, honestly, all these transphobic women who, like, grift on being losers, they're losers and they're bad sports about it. You can't even, like, even the ones who win. We covered that one recently who actually won her match and she still displayed bad sportsmanship by being just super transphobic afterward. The big lie.
You're a class act. And you've been a leader. You've
Oh,
told
so
your story.
classy.
Many of us on this side of the aisle have heard your story many times, and we respect what you're doing, and we stand with you. I just want you to know that.
Well, I appreciate that a whole lot.
Yeah, so they're like, we're gonna definitely try to restrict trans women's access to sports because we support you so much. GOP against losing gracefully? Color me surprised. I know, Divinity, I know. I don't think there's a video for this part. At one point, this hearing became quite contentious because Representative Summer Lee, in her opening statement, expressed some apprehension that the testimony might turn transphobic. Subsequently, Riley Gaines labeled her a misogynist during Riley Gaines' testimony. Representative Lee sought to have the comment stricken from the record, citing Gaines, quote, engaging in personalities, which is a term for personal attacks, which does violate the committee's rules. In response, Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene retorted, men disguising themselves as women are engaging in personalities. So Greene faced no disciplinary action, and Representative Lee's motion was not upheld. It's not just whether or not you agree in someone being a misogynist. It's like, you're not supposed to engage in a personal attack in this forum, and they allowed it because they hate women. Like, they hate women and they hate trans people, so there's just absolutely no reason for them not to allow. They censured Zoe Zephyr because she said, like, you know, you have blood on your hands because you're restricting youth access, and like, so she broke decorum, but engaging in personalities, which is explicitly against the committee's rules, they're going to allow it when they don't like the people that are being insulted. You know, when the people are being insulted and they're like, I agree that that person is a piece of shit, they're just gonna like go with that. It's such a functional government we have. It's amazing. So basically at the conclusion of the hearing, Representative Lisa McClain, who is the chair of the committee, she announced her intentions to introduce a national Save Women's Sports Act. The legislation is going to aim to prohibit trans students from participating in sports that align with their gender identity throughout the United States. Yeah, and like obviously she probably doesn't have the votes to pass it, like I said earlier, but you know, they want you to know that this is their plan going forward, is they're going to make it their national platform to restrict trans rights. So any conservative judges that get appointed during the next 4 years, most likely they're going to toe the party line on the transphobia issue. I guess it just depends. The elections have by and large not been going their way. When they use the trans issue as the wedge issue, we've said it multiple times, they did not do well in the United States most recent elections. But right, if you want women's sports to be better, maybe fund them, but no, they won't have that conversation. It's just like the pro-life issue. They will claim to be pro-life, but then once the baby is born, they don't want you to have welfare. They don't want you to have food stamps. They don't want to help you at all. They don't want to subsidize childcare so that you can hold down a job. They don't actually care. It's just like, you know, they care about women's sports, quote unquote, to the extent that it allows them to be transphobic. But once the trans issue gets wrapped up and like, oh, trans people aren't allowed in the sports, whatever, cool, done and dusted. We've done the transphobia successfully. The women's sports are still going to be underfunded. There's still going to be like a cultural idea that women's sports sucks, so it's not going to be watched as much. You know, the PR of women's sports itself is a thing that could use some work, and it would help if you let women compete against men. Maybe women's sports as a whole concept is a failure because, again, it's predicated on the false idea that women are inherently inferior to some people. And to other people, it's like a means of preserving male supremacy because they know secretly that they're threatened by the fact that women can compete. Try convincing cis women that they're actually not pathetic and they can actually compete against men. And like, I don't know why this is the most difficult part of the conversation apparently, but what we need is for women to demand that sports be desegregated. Yeah, sports doesn't need to be gendered. Do weight and height classes if that's gonna be the thing that bothers you so much, but sports is inherently unfair. Michael Phelps is a freak with extra long arms. Like, it's inherently an unfair system. It's about finding out what are the limits of human achievement. Like, what are the limits of the possibilities? And if everybody's on the same even playing field, if you're regulating the hormones of mildly intersex people, like people who just have a little bit of a hormone difference, if you're like monitoring them and making them be physically the same, and you're like forcing there to be no differences in the sports, like, oh, you're too tall, you can't play this sport at all, instead of being like, oh man, he's the tallest guy who's ever played basketball, that's fucking cool. And like, did he do much better than everybody else? Like, ooh, let's see how well he can do in his career when we sign him on our team, right? Like, that's the whole fucking thing, is like, it's a bunch of different freaks of nature competing to see how intense we can go with it. Sex testing pretty much drove Caster Semenya out of sports entirely. Exactly. Caster Semenya and several other black women have been basically, they're allowed to participate in certain, this is the weird thing, is that they are allowed to participate in certain sports, but not others. It's super weird. They have to consent to hormone medicine to like change their hormone levels, or they won't be allowed to play. Like Caster Semenya might have a hormone disorder or like a chromosomal difference, but she was born a cis woman. She just has higher than average testosterone, and that's like a normal human deviation. But because, yeah, we decided that sports needs to be binary, all in the name of maintaining the two gender system. Yep, it's all fabricated. If it was natural, you would not need to try so hard to maintain the quote natural order. You wouldn't need to try so hard. Merry holidays and Happy New Year to my patrons and potential future patrons. Today, I would love to thank Tiago Nascimento, Mersh Rolvag, Amanda B., Michelle Frateroli, Wellington Marcus, Michelle Winter, Danielle McDonald, DZXN, Suzanne Maynard, Spooky Heather Sylvia, Passnell Infinity, Jamie Jam, Nova, Elizabeth Bartell, Sojo, Sarah A., Kevin Young, Athiet, Celeste, Desi Quiche, Liam Hodgson, and Mr. Atheist.